Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the final session of the day. For those of you who were not around at the beginning of the day, I'm Nick Bowes. I'm the Chief Exec of Centre for London. We're really pleased that we've got a really good session at the end of the day for you today. We're going to be joined by Councillor Susan Aitken, who's the leader of Glasgow City Council, and really pleased that Susan's found time to join us today. It's a particularly busy day today, which I'm sure Susan will talk about, but also Glasgow's hosting COP26 later on in the autumn, and the whole world's attention is going to be on Glasgow. Here in London, we're very magnanimous about that. Obviously, we would particularly have liked maybe to have hosted COP, but if it had to go to any other city in the UK, going to Glasgow is fantastic. As a city I know very well, spent many I've been there many times over the years and had many good evenings out in Glasgow, and it's a city that's very close to my heart. So we're going to have a short introduction from Susan, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions, but I don't want to eat into too much of Susan's time, so I'm going to hand straight over to Susan. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone from Glasgow. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity to address this Countdown to Net Zero London conference. I would say that you're not the only city to have expressed some envy about Glasgow being the COP26 host, but as a privilege, undoubtedly is. It is a huge responsibility to be the host of COP and leadership at that. But one of the great things about it over the past year, 18 months or so, was this opportunity is sharing what have become really the conjoined issues of our times, which is the climate emergency and recovering from the global pandemic, which cities worldwide are going to have to respond to now simultaneously. I mean, there's also an opportunity for me to tell the story of my city to new audiences, and that is the story of a city that's continually rising to meet its challenges and to embrace change. I'm often asked what I want to be Glasgow's COP26 legacy, and I want the world to be able to celebrate the Glasgow Agreement for the name of my city to be forever associated with the moment that we collectively, globally, reset the path for our planet. But I also want COP26 to leave its mark on Glasgow, that it's not just something that happens in the city, but for us and with us. And the increasing importance of cities in the climate agenda, the focus that there will be, I'm absolutely certain, in November on the practical measures to achieve net zero and the centrality of the lives of our citizens in that. I think that can give real hope and optimism to ordinary Glaswegians and Londoners alike, that there's something tangible in all of this, in this agenda for them, that it actually matters to their day-to-day lives. So I want to make sure that Glasgow can take advantage of the global profile of our host status, a profile that we've never had before, really. We may be one of the world's most talked about cities this year. That's not really something that's happened to Glasgow before. So we are very conscious that we have an opportunity here, and a finite opportunity at that, where we take the opportunity to create opportunities for investment in the emerging green economy by showing the world that we are a city that is committed to sustainability, and in doing so better shaping a more equitable and a more prosperous city for the future. COP26 is more than just a focal point. I believe it can be a pivotal moment for modern Glasgow, for modern Scotland, as indeed for London, and cities in particular right across the world. But it is understandable to ask, and I know that great event hosting cities in the UK like London have been asking, why Glasgow? And I do think it's one that Glaswegians have been asking themselves as well. And most of you, I think, will know something about Glasgow. Our history is rooted in the high carbon and the unsustainable industries of the 19th and 20th centuries. We were a birthplace of the first industrial revolution. The proximity of what was then a small port city to natural resources saw Glasgow rapidly become one of the titans of the industrial age. Along the banks of the River Clyde that runs through the heart of the city and our wider metropolitan region, we built the ships and the machinery that enabled an empire. And that lends, I believe, a particular pertinence to our host status. Because the collapse of heavy industry in the late 20th century heralded an age of devastation and despair for Glasgow. But we did endure, we survived, and we've re-emerged as a vibrant and an innovative city, one with a global reputation now for culture, for hospitality, for sport. We're home to internationally recognised universities. We've got a diverse and growing skills and knowledge base. We're fast becoming a world leader in new low-carbon economies within digital science and technology, and indeed within the UK, outside London, Glasgow is home to more low-carbon companies and industries than any other UK city. And we have become pretty good at staging big international events as well. And we've got a great venue in the Scottish Events Campus. But legacies of our past remain, and indeed they still hang heavy over us. Vacant and derelict land still blights too much of our city, and it's a blight that affects the well-being of communities, particularly the most deprived communities. The more deprived an area you're in, the more likely you are to live next to post-industrial vacant and derelict land. Scotland's busiest stretch of motorway cuts right through the heart of our city, and the core of Glasgow, still operating within its Victorian grid structure, is the location of several of the UK's worst pollution hotspots. Because of that, and because too much crosstown traffic was directed right through our city centre. So in the city with the lowest car ownership rates in the UK, we still nonetheless have an estimated 300 deaths a year attributable to air pollution, again with the most deprived citizens most disproportionately affected by that. And our failure in the past to equip those communities that were most affected, especially those with the deep and long-standing connections to heavy industry, with the skills and the jobs and the social policies to deal with the fallout from its collapse, that has a devastating and a generational impact, with cycles of worklessness and poor health now perpetuated over generations. So we talk a lot about transition now and just transition within the climate agenda, but transition's defined Glasgow now for decades, and how we've sought to move on from our high carbon past has been Glasgow's economic and social backdrop for over 40 years now. But that's anything but a unique story. And it's why in many ways Glasgow is the ideal host for COP26, because while the contexts and the scales may differ, there's a typicality to the challenges and the imperfections that post-industrial cities like ours face now or will face in the future. And cities just like ours are where the solutions to the greatest, the most challenging challenges of sustainability are going to be found, and are going to have to be found. The city networks that we are part of, both within the UK and internationally, are putting shared challenges very much into those real contexts. And what I'd like to share today is a brief flavour of the approaches that we're taking in Glasgow to meet those challenges and to guide us through a transition which this time can't be like the transition that we had in our immediate, when we lost our heavy industry. This time it must be a just and equitable transition, or it will be a failure. Of that I'm absolutely certain. It's clear that Glasgow City Council, the city government that I lead, can't deliver transition alone, nor for that matter can government at any level. I think we've long recognised the need for strong partnerships within Glasgow, bringing together political leadership, business, our universities and colleges, our civil society. Municipal isolationism in the past did Glasgow few favours, and we've learned from that. So the administration that I've led since 2017, which was the first new political administration in the city in 40 years, has nurtured that Team Glasgow approach so that we can better shape and inform the policies that are demanded by a modern city. And that really came into its own actually during the pandemic, when we convened very quickly economic and social recovery task forces, twin task forces, very shortly after the first lockdowns, and they've made their recommendations that we've been able to accelerate implementation on because of that combined shared approach. And the team approach is also evident in Sustainable Glasgow, which is our cross-sectoral coalition mobilised by very much by that partnership principle in order to lead Glasgow's journey to carbon net zero by 2030, which is the target that we have enshrined in our Climate Emergency Action Plan, which was passed by Council just a few weeks ago, in fact. Similarly, that Climate Action Plan, which is our blueprint for climate action and aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is born of consultation and cooperation, not just with other institutions and with other sectors, but with citizens as well, with residents of Glasgow. And it's the job, I think, of elected leadership in cities like Glasgow and indeed London to provide the direction and the focus and the policies for transition. But we need new relationships as well as the existing ones that we've built on. New relationships with innovators, with investors, identifying where the private sector can help us identify the challenges and work with us to deliver the solutions. To give you just one example, in Glasgow we are working very closely with Scottish Power on a solution to providing electric vehicle charging points in a city where 70% of our population lives in high density housing, basically of one kind or other. And I cite that because this is a really good example of how a city working together, different sectors and different partners pointing in the same direction and aligning our goals, work to overcome barriers. And global investors will of course want to use the profile of COP to build bigger, stronger and more resilient bases. And they'll want locations that are ready to embrace change, places they can have confidence in their investments. And we believe Glasgow has the relationships, the ecosystems, the track record in innovation and research, and the citywide commitment to be a location like that. We're not reinventing the wheel. Cities like Glasgow have long been the crucibles of social innovation. To address our long-standing challenges, we have been at the vanguard of progressive approaches like the inclusive economic growth agenda, the well-being economy, community wealth building, and circular economy approaches as well. And the climate emergency is therefore interconnected within our existing policy landscape. It doesn't sit alone, and indeed it really can't and shouldn't sit alone. Again, a couple of examples. Over the 4 years of my administration, we've developed the case for an entirely new public transport mode in Glasgow. I've already talked about how we, as a city, historically have been overly reliant on the private car, despite the fact that a majority of our citizens indeed don't own one. So the Glasgow Metro is in part a response to that over-reliance on private vehicles and the emissions that they generate and the need for us to decarbonise our transport systems. But simultaneously, it can also support inward investment and inclusive growth by connecting what are currently poorly served and poorly connected communities to employment, to training and social and cultural opportunities, and opening up those underdeveloped areas of vacant and derelict post-industrial land that I referred to earlier. So the Metro is currently being considered by Scotland's National Transport Agency as a key project for them to take forward with an announcement due in the autumn. I hope just before COP26, that would be very nice timing. And in Metro, though, not only do we have a transformative green infrastructure project to target long-term challenges, but also a shovel-ready project that we can address shorter-term needs and an immediate reduction in those emissions. Similarly, we have a focus on the retrofitting of hundreds of thousands of homes across our metropolitan region, the Glasgow City region of about 2.1 million people. I know that seems small for London, but it's big for Scotland. Believe me, we are Scotland's only true metropolitan city region. And that retrofitting of homes will make the inroads that we need into our other big source of emissions alongside transport. But again, it will also provide skills and training that the new green economy is going to demand, as well as addressing the long-standing issue of fuel poverty, which is one of our biggest social justice challenges in the city of Glasgow particularly. And then there's the centrality of our citizens within the transition. Probably for the first time in our history, we know to a very significant extent what the future is going to look like. And in comparison to the transition, immediate post-industrial transition that I spoke about that Glasgow went through previously, this time our people must be ready, and political leaders like myself have a responsibility to make sure that we get them ready to access the opportunities that the new economy is going to bring. It was and has been a source of pride for me that what's now being called the Glasgow message, that climate justice and social equity must go hand in hand and must be even more of an acute priority, was adopted by the UN-affiliated local government and municipal authorities constituency as part of its roadmap to COP. They had 6 pillars and they adopted the Glasgow message as the 7th pillar of that roadmap. So we are making our mark. Our city brand is People Make Glasgow. And by working with our partners across all sectors to ensure our people are at the centre of this, we can work together to make Glasgow greener, healthier, more prosperous, with that just transition at the centre of it, and just resilience and a just future to that low carbon economy. I mentioned earlier, just in conclusion, how Glasgow, I believe, can be a demonstrator city, not solely on the necessary physical intervention we're going to need to get to net zero, but the social policies that we're also going to nurture that equitable transition. We've made our voice loud and clear on the need for our citizens and their well-being to be front and centre of that. I believe that we can match ambition and achievement, combining green and inclusive urban communities with a green and inclusive economy, and working with other cities globally in implementing both policies for decarbonisation. We can collectively ensure a just transition for our own citizens, but also for citizens of the planet, global citizens worldwide. I have no doubt that Glasgow and London, along with other cities, have the collective will, the knowledge and the courage to make it happen. And it's a real honour to be able to talk to you about it this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think just listening to what you've talked about today, you're going to do the country proud later on in the year when you host COP. I don't think anybody could question your ambition to put on a good show to the world. Just like Cornwall benefited so fantastically from having the G7 summit the other week, I'm sure the Glasgow is going to benefit in the same way when the whole world's focus is on you come October, November. We have got time just for a few questions, and if people do want to post questions in the Q&A function on Hopin, please do. Similarly, you can upvote other questions if you're watching on YouTube. We've also got the hashtag on Twitter, London to Zero. We've got a question here, Susan, from Joshua Nyko. Joshua asks, do you think the 2030 target is so unrealistic that it's actually counterproductive and it discourages effective but gradual approaches to cutting emissions? What do you think about that?
I don't know, and I don't think it's that unrealistic either. And I think partly we have to believe that it is deliverable, because national targets are not going to be delivered without cities going faster. I think our challenge, and the challenge of all cities, is to convince national governments that that's the case, that they are not going to meet. In Scotland, it's a reduction of 70% by 2030 and net zero by 2045. In the UK, obviously, it's net zero by 2050. I would expect that timescale to become a bit shorter, actually, as we get closer to COP. I think that would be a reasonable guess. But I think it has to be a really strong message to governments that they're going to have to front load investment and action, and indeed to investors worldwide, because clearly this is the scale and pace of transition that we're talking about here is not going to be delivered by governments alone at any level. Front load it into cities, or yes, we will fail, we will collectively fail to meet our targets. But if we have a clear understanding of what's required and the kind of work that we are doing in Glasgow, and I know we're not alone in this, and I've talked to other city leaders in the UK and worldwide, looking at what are the big interventions that we require to really get into those emissions and cut them as much as possible. And we have to do it the hard way in cities as well. You know, nature-based solutions are an incredibly important part of this, but we're not going to be able to offset all of our emissions. We are going to have to decarbonise the hard way, through transport, through domestic heat, and various, and through green infrastructure within our cities. But if we have a clear understanding of what those interventions are, how much they're going to cost, who's going to pay for them, and I think we need to be clear that a just transition means that city residents can't be bearing the cost of that, and we shape them as investable propositions, then I do think it is realistic. And I think we have to treat it as though it's realistic, because if we start off by saying we're not going to manage this, then we're going to start dropping things off that are too difficult right from the start, and then the whole agenda will get away from us, and all of the targets and ambitions will get away from us. So let's start as ambitious as possible, and I think if we don't do that, then that will be what undermines progress, if we're too timid to begin with.
Thank you, Susan. That's really helpful. Just today, Glasgow, as part of the Climate Ready Clyde coalitions, produced a very stark report, which has highlighted that there's 2 million people in the Greater Glasgow area face severe disruption from climate heating if we don't do more to tackle climate change, and has identified that there's a shortfall of £184 million a year just on all of the things that we need to do to prevent the runaway climate change. There's no question in the ambition of cities like Glasgow or London or Manchester, but there's clearly a real problem in finding the finance to be able to do the things that cities want to do. I mean, how do you plan to kind of get across that very large hurdle if central governments are just not prepared to either give you the powers or give you the funding? How do we solve that problem?
So I think there's a couple of things here, and you're right, that adaptation strategy, we believe that's the first adaptation strategy of scale in the UK, and that's the other side of this agenda, of course, as well as mitigation. Have to be thinking about the impact that climate change is having on our citizens right now, and it's not only in the global south that's seen the number of catastrophic flooding events go up by a huge amount in recent years. There's no question this is it's quite a new space for cities and municipalities, probably London being the exception within the UK. We're not used to dealing with interventions and investments of the scale that this is going to require. And perhaps give you some context. Glasgow, in the past couple of years, one of the things that my administration inherited was a long-standing equal pay issue, over a decade old, long-standing injustice. Thousands of women who work for the council had been paid less than they were worth compared to male counterparts. So we settled that. We negotiated a settlement to that, and we paid out a settlement which was in the around £500 million. And we borrowed off the building assets that we have in the city, which we're very lucky to have significant built assets which have a revenue stream. So we were able to borrow off of that. That at the time was one of the biggest financial deals being done on the UK financial markets. And it was certainly the biggest financial deal that any local authority in Scotland had come anywhere near. We think that the retrofitting programme, the building retrofitting programme across the Glasgow City region, again of about 400,000, sorry, let me get this right, nearly 500,000 houses, will cost in the region of £9 billion. So, you know, it absolutely dwarfs anything that we've done before. So we have to actively shape that as an investable proposition. And I think the message to governments, for me, it's becoming really clear, is governments themselves can put capital resource into these interventions, but actually local authorities and cities in particular are in a really, really good position to borrow. And global investors are looking more and more to municipalities as good places for safe investments. But our citizens shouldn't have to pay for that borrowing, because this is a contribution to a national and indeed global effort that we are doing. So maybe what government should be doing is looking at funding the borrowing of cities, and that will allow us to deliver these interventions at the pace and scale that's needed to make those inroads into the emissions that we require over the next decade, because this really does have to happen within the next decade and be absolutely really front foot that investment within the next 10 years.
Thank you, Susan. I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time. So I had a list of lots of other questions I would have liked to have asked. But
I know I took longer in my opening remarks. I always end up ad-libbing. So my apologies for that. It's entirely my fault.
It was good to hear so much about your plans and your ambitions for Glasgow. I think we all wish you the best of luck on the coming weeks and months ahead of COP26. I'm sure you're going to put on a fantastic show. So best of luck with everything. And we're looking forward to seeing you in the global spotlight, and hopefully will lead to some dramatic decisions being taken that are going to help us in these big battles ahead. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We've come to the end of today's proceedings. I did just want to say at the end, just again, a few thank yous, because a lot of people behind the scenes have made today happen. This is not the usual way we would organise a conference. This is the first time we've organised a hybrid conference. So first of all, thank you to all of those of you who are watching remotely for bearing with us if we've had any minor hiccups. It's the first time we've ever used Hopin, and we've learned a lot today too. And can I say thank you to the sponsors of today's events, the major sponsors Uber, our supporting sponsors KPF, London Borough of Hounslow, and our exhibiting partner Living Streets. And thank you again to KPF for hosting us here today in our offices in Covent Garden. Thanks to all of my events colleagues behind the scenes today who've worked so hard on the last couple of weeks and months, and again during today to make today happen. There is still time for you to use the networking function on Hopin, which will be open for the next 30 minutes. So please do make the most of that if you can. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you to all of the speakers, panelists and chairs of today's sessions. It's been a really, really rich discussion today on a very, very important topic. We've learned a lot. We've heard lots of views, lots of thoughts, lots of ideas, which is precisely what we needed. And it's our job now to try and turn that and synthesize that into something that can help and support the city's policymakers and decision makers. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Do get in touch if you're interested in hearing more about what Centre for London does. And hopefully I'll see you at our next event, which fingers crossed might even be in person. Thank you.